Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. In this podcast, I chat with industry experts and thought leaders about the latest trends related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Each episode, I ask just one question tied to current events. The goal is to leave you with the tools that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. In March of 2020, Juliette Bork and Andrea Titus released an article in the Harvard Business Review titled "The Keys to Inclusive Leadership." And they found that what leaders say and do makes up to a 70% difference as to whether an individual reports feeling included in the workplace. You can scroll through your LinkedIn feed and you'll see countless posts, blogs, and videos about inclusive leadership. And it's clear that inclusive leadership is now a competency that is critical for leading in today's workplace. And yet, for all the real estate and mindshare this topic is taking up, I have to wonder how many leaders truly feel competent in this area. So, for today's question, I'm asking, what type of self work do you need to do to confidently and competently lead culture change in your organization? And to answer today's question, I'm joined by Nancy Harris. Nancy is a respected leadership and diversity coach, facilitator, and workplace reinventor. She helps leaders uncover talent opportunities that will deliver long-lasting, impactful business results. She has a wealth of experience in all things people-related, and her passion and enthusiasm has led her to work in a wide range of industries and organizations, including BP, Accenture, Hillshire Brands, Pfizer, Motorola, and the Ford Motor Company. She's also the co-founder of Disrupt HR Chicago. She's on the board of directors for the Chicago Society for Human Resource Management. And she's been a guest lecturer at the University of Southern California Marshall School of Business. And she's also the host of the Intersection podcast. Nancy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It is wonderful to be here, Melissa.
I know that you often work with leadership in the work that you do.
Yes.
And we've had a number of conversations about, this term inclusive leadership and what does this actually look like? And where do leaders fit in driving change within their organizations? So I'd love to just sort of ask you, what kind of work do leaders need to do, or what are you seeing in the work that you're doing?
To me, when I think of leaders, they are the linchpin, right? And it's so important for them to kind of step back and think about where are they on their own individual DEI journey and how they demonstrate leadership and how they demonstrate inclusive leadership in particular is so important. It's interesting, Melissa. I just had a conversation with someone I was coaching literally about a half an hour before this. And that was the question that we were asking. He was like, how do I walk the walk, not just talk the talk about inclusive leadership? And one of the things I said is it's really important to just take small steps. And so one of the things we talked about, and this is going to sound so small to you, but it was ensuring that when you introduce yourself, you use your pronouns. When you're on a Zoom call, you have those listed. And, he was thinking, okay, never really thought about that. And I said, yeah. I also had another conversation with another leader, and they were like, I don't feel comfortable putting my pronouns. And I was like, but it's not about you. It's about by you doing that, you're demonstrating to other people who you're talking to that this is a safe space, this is an inclusive space for somebody to show up fully as who they are.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. You talked about leaders being the linchpin of the organization. And so I don't know if this is how you've experienced this, but we often will come and say, okay, people will say, we're going to start with the leaders, and then hopefully the training or the information will trickle down. Or we'll start with employees, and then I think, on DEI training, and then the leaders sort of get lost in the shuffle. Either that never happens, or they have separate training, or there sort of seems to be sometimes a disconnect. Leaders will say, well, or they get signed up to do the training, but they don't attend, or they're half-heartedly engaged. So there seems to be sometimes a disconnect. And I heard one person say, that is for my employees. So I'm on there and I kind of check, but I don't need to do it.
In an ideal world, you are educating everyone at the same time. So they're hearing the same messages. But if I step back even before that, before you get to a point of talking about learning and development or training, it's really important for the organization to say why. Why are they doing this work? Why are they having leaders and employees go through training? And we can spend some more time talking about training, but I think oftentimes that's unclear. So your example of kind of resistance, well, I'm just seeing that my employees go and just, checking to make sure that they've done what they're supposed to do, and I'm just going to sit back hands off, doesn't work, and I'm sure that doesn't work. But oftentimes leaders aren't doing it because they don't know why. They don't
Mm.
understand why the organization is now saying everyone's required to go through unconscious bias training or some other type of training. And so I think getting really crystal clear before, talking about who you're engaging and why you're engaging them in any type of learning as it relates to DEI is to really get clear on why the organization is doing what they're doing.
So let's actually just go back and I gave that example. If an organization or if a leader says, you know what, okay, I know that this is important. I'm hearing feedback from my managers who are hearing feedback from their reports that this is something that's important. I want to do it, but I have no idea what to do. Where should they start? Is training the best place? And I'm obviously we do training, but I'm not sure if that's always the best place, right? You mentioned we got to get crystal clear on why we're doing this. So where do you typically start when you're working with folks or you're supporting leaders along their journey?
Melissa, I always start with that question of asking them why. Sometimes they'll be really honest and they'll say, well, it's because our head of XYZ fill in the blank, VP of People and Culture, or our head of the organization, CEO, Executive Director, says this is what we're supposed to be doing. But I really think it's important for leaders to get clear on why they're doing it, right? They're in roles where they have teams, or even if they don't have teams, they may be leading groups and projects within an organization. And so it's really important for them to stop and slow down. So, where do I start? I ask them why. Why is this important for them? And if they can't answer that, there's going to be some problems there because that lack of clarity is going to show up ultimately in a lack of commitment, and then it's going to show up in a lack of clarity for those folks that they work with. So it's really got to, that to me is like the absolute starting point. So if you don't have somebody over there like a Melissa or myself saying why, just then you pause and ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why is this important? Why is this important for my team?
I think a lot of folks then, once they've answered that, I think often I find it's not a lack of will or desire, but there's a lot of lack of confidence or sort of knowing where to start and what to do. And I think it's really neat that you coach people because so many leaders, I think they're like, okay, I hear this, like I'm reading this, everything tells me in the world right now. Like I said, you scroll through all your LinkedIn feeds, HBR articles, whatever, Forbes, all these things are saying inclusive leadership. Like this is it. This is where you have to be. If you're going to be successful in today's workplace, you need to be an inclusive leader. What does that actually look like? And how do we get there?
Well, what does it look like? I mean, one of the examples that we can spend some time talking about is, starting with yourself in terms of, again, it's this self-reflection and this question, what's your why, right? But also thinking about what do you want people to feel like on your teams, which is often something that we don't think about or we don't ask that question because it seems like touchy feely.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got a group of people, like, what do you want them to feel like? What do you want to feel like when you step into a space? And so it's the why, and it's also this piece around what do you want people to feel like?
Mm.
You asked about maybe like resources, or there's lots of resources. I mean, there's lots of places to start. I almost will tell people if you had a like the dart board, right? And you just pick a place to start.
Mm.
But sometimes if you don't know where to start, there are some, assessments that you might want to use. One of them is the IDI, which is the Intercultural Development. I believe the other I is index. But if you're not sure at all, maybe start with an assessment like IDI for yourself or for your team, just to get a better understanding of maybe what are the next steps that you can take from there. Obviously, you could also work with, a coach that specializes in, either IDI or who's IDI trained, or just does diversity or inclusive leadership coaching, and starting there just to kind of peel back the later layers in terms of getting more specific around where it is that you want to start as a leader.
I know that we've often talked about a few times, and I'm going to be honest, I have attributed this quote to you, Nancy, but I've said like one of the things that we often find is that leaders will support initiatives. They'll sign off on the budgets. They'll be there to sort of show up and support whatever initiatives are, or that they engage with a DI person and they'll say, okay, so what are we doing? What are we doing? And I know that you've used this fantastic metaphor around leaders having to get in and actually do the work as well.
Yes, it is really important when you are talking about DEI that you yourself do your own work. I don't care if you're picking up a book and you're reading. I don't care if you're listening to, some podcasts, but you have to start there. You also can't say, oh, I'm going to hand over on a platter the DEI work to Melissa or to, again, the DEI consultant, or another famous place that people like to kind of move DEI over to is human resources, right? And so they'll say, well, I'm not the expert. You're the expert. Yes, but you're the leader, right? If I'm an employee, I don't want to hear the HR person. No disrespect to my HR colleagues. I have 20 years in HR. You want to hear from your leader.
Mm-hmm.
That's who you want to hear from. So I think it's so important. If you don't know something, say you don't know. People would rather hear that than hear from someone else. And can I give an example?
Yeah.
There was a leader that I was coaching in 2020, and it was around the time of George Floyd murder. And there was, much social unrest across the globe. And the leader that I was working with was a white gentleman. And he said, I don't think I'm going to say anything. Right. Like he didn't feel equipped to address his team and say anything. And I said, okay. You don't have to come in and have a long drawn out speech. I said, but what you can do is acknowledge what's happened. You can acknowledge what's going on. You can acknowledge that you don't have all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can just create a space and see what happens. And he did that. And he was like, wow, that was really powerful. It just created a space for people to have conversation. He didn't have to have all the answers because he acknowledged he didn't have all the answers. He could have had an expert in there. They wouldn't have had all the answers either.
Mm-hmm.
But it was that step of just kind of acknowledging, and, whether you want to call it vulnerable leadership or courageous leadership, or just, acknowledging what's going on and not trying to sweep things under the rug, that was a really powerful, and he said like a powerful turning point for him.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting is that a lot of times inclusive leadership, or a lot of the same skills that make a great leader make an inclusive leader, but it's thinking about that from a specific lens and perspective, and thinking
Yes.
about being really intentional about how you're interacting with your employees and noticing and relating to people in a way that sort of demonstrates understanding that we all have different experiences coming at this because of our identities, and such that like we can't just be sort of blanketly interacting with folks. We have to be thinking about what else is happening in their lives that they're bringing to work with them.
Yeah, and it's a myth that, people are leaving, whatever it is at their house, and then, coming in either to the virtual workspace or the actual in real life space, and leaving that all behind. And that's a myth that we've got to just burst. let's get that out, that people are people and you're showing up as a whole person. I mean, there's probably somebody out there that can say that they can totally compartmentalize, but for the vast majority of us, we're coming in and we're bringing that into the workplace.
And I know you've used a sort of, I don't know if I call it a metaphor analogy, but when for those leaders who are, you talked about that we're just going to sort of shove this off on HR or the consultant, and you'll just sign the checks or approve the budget or whatever it is that you're doing, is that you sort of likened it to, if you hired a personal trainer, would you expect that trainer to do the sit-ups when you watch them, or are you gonna do the sit-ups as well? And you sort of liken that. And I love this one, and I think I've name dropped this or name dropped you a few times on some things that people are like. I love that idea that like you wouldn't just hire a fitness coach and watch them exercise.
I mean, it sounds great.
If that
It
worked, yeah,
sounds fantastic, but it's not going to work, right?
yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, fantastic. You do the weights. Or even if I use that analogy and I add on the beginning piece, let's say you're getting ready to hire a good personal trainer. That person is going to sit down with you the first time that they meet you and they're going to say, Melissa, tell me, what are your goals? Why are you doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing that we forget when I go back to like, what's the why? We don't do that. It's like, okay, you're going to say, well, you know what? I'm trying to tone up muscles or I'm trying to lose 15 pounds for whatever reason, right? You're giving that person something to go on. But they're also going to tell you too, all right, that's great. I know why you're doing it. We can help put some plans or goals around that and metrics in place. And you got to get to the gym and you got to lift the weights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really important part, is that and the way that you started this is that, and it's not always, we want to stick on the weightlifting metaphor, goodness, I hope not, but it doesn't have to be these massive things. It's this small, as you mentioned, putting your pronouns in your email signature and on your Zoom or Teams or wherever it is. It's these smaller things that demonstrate that you're noticing and that you are um, that you're leading by example, is modeling the behaviors that you want your team to model as well.
Absolutely. And I've started to take my own advice on this as well too, as I facilitate workshops. And oftentimes we'll tell people, oh, ensure that you've got, oh, one is about the camera, right? So I think that there may be people, especially I've worked with in educational institutions, where maybe people don't feel comfortable like sharing their backgrounds, right? So that might be why their camera's off. But one of the things I started doing in terms of creating inclusive spaces was just saying, not everybody feels comfortable speaking. Not everybody feels comfortable using the chat because depending on the space that they're in, there may not be a lot of psychological safety, let's say, within that organization. So I said, well, you know what? If you've got a question, you can also send a direct message to my. So then that way, you can ask the question, you can feel safe, and you don't have to kind of put it out there for everybody to see. And so again, it goes back to being really intentional and asking yourself, and I always say, not only is it about being intentional, but it really is also about slowing down,
Mm.
which is counterintuitive to most of the cultures in which we're living in and operating in, where everything is, 1 mile, a minute. But as a leader, again, be intentional, slow down, and just say, where can I show up as a more inclusive leader? What's one small thing, just one small thing that I can do to make this meeting, this group meeting, this one-on-one interaction that I had just a little bit more inclusive for the people that I'm interacting with.
I think that's really a really important point. I want to give you the last word, Nancy, here, and sort of summarize or go back to the thing. And it's like, what kind of self work do leaders need to do if this is they've answered their why, and that this is not just I've read everything and it's like, okay, I got to be an inclusive leader, but they've realized that I want people on my team to feel like they belong, and so I know that I have to take this seriously. What kind of self work can they do? to do this? Like, what's the one thing you'd like our listeners to take away from our conversation today?
The one thing that came to my mind was the old Nike ad from, I don't know when it was, just do it. And that just do it is less focused on, as you mentioned, reading a book, which is great, or doing an assessment, but just do it. If you do nothing else, I'm going back to the name of your podcast. Just ask yourself that one question before you start a meeting, before you interact with anyone. That's your self-work. You're going to ask that question. What's the one thing that I can do to make this more inclusive?
I love it. Nancy, for those who are interested in learning about more about your work or are interested in keeping up with you, where can they go?
They can find me in a couple of different places. My website, which is restartconsult.com. They can also find me on LinkedIn, which is where I'm the most active, and that's just under my name, which is Nancy Harris. They can also find me on Instagram, but I can't remember the name.
Okay,
I think it's I don't know. I should know, but yeah, you can find that out. But again, most active on LinkedIn and finding out information on my website as well too.
And we have to send people to your podcast because it's absolutely fantastic. You have amazing guests and you're a fantastic interviewer. I can speak from experience. So where can they find you on your
Thank
podcast?
you. Yeah, so the name of the podcast is called The Intersection Podcast with Nancy Harris, and that can be found on any of the channels that have podcasts, so iTunes and Spotify, and those are the big ones.
Perfect. Yeah. And we'll
Yes.
put all of Nancy's contact information in our show notes as well.
Yeah,
So
wonderful. It's
thank you,
weird being on this
Nancy.
side of the
I
the
know it's
the, the,
always
the microphone.
it's totally different experience, but as I said, Nancy's a fantastic interviewer. So if you have a chance, you should check out her podcast. They're awesome.
Thank
Um,
you.
so I want to thank you again for sharing your thoughts and your experience. For those of you, if you have your own questions or would like to be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Until next time, I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, and this is Just One Q.